Hi folks. Tonight, we begin with the final days of Queen Elizabeth I, the last monarch of the Tudor line and one of England's most unforgettable queens. She ruled for over 4 decades, guiding her country through a time of discovery, of poetry and power, of new lands and old enemies. But behind the golden throne, behind the pageantry and command, was a woman. A woman who carried deep sorrow and who met her end in a way still wrapped in quiet mystery. Before we begin this soft journey into the past, take a moment to settle in. Dim your lights, maybe turn on a small fan. Let its hum fill the silence like a distant lullaby. And if you'd like, you can close your eyes and allow the slow rhythm of this story to hold you gently. Now, breathe slowly and let's drift back to a winter long ago. The year is 1602. Elizabeth, once youthful and brilliant, was now nearing her 70th year. In those days, such an age was rare. Her skin, once powdered pale like porcelain, could no longer hide the softness and frailty beneath. Her wigs, once fiery red gold and full of strength, rested atop a body tired from nearly 50 years of rule. She had reigned alone, never a husband, never a child. She had survived those who tried to bring her down. She had buried her lovers, her enemies, even her friends. But now, something was changing. Her sharp mind remained, but her presence was fading. Those closest to her began to notice it. She ate very little. She stopped showing up at court as often, and the bright fire that had once glowed so clearly from her throne at Whitehall now seemed distant, fading. Rumours passed through the quiet halls of Richmond Palace. They whispered gently that their queen was slipping away. Part of her sorrow may have begun a year earlier. In 1601, she had signed the death warrant for Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He had been bold, handsome, impulsive. He flattered her, then defied her, then begged for her trust again. Some said she loved him, like a son. Others said it was deeper than that. Whatever the truth, his rebellion forced her hand. He tried to take power by force, and Elizabeth, with great pain, ordered his execution. She watched him fall to the axe, and afterward, something inside her seemed to shatter. She never truly came back from that loss. That final winter, Elizabeth would often stand for hours without moving. She refused to sleep. She barely ate. Her voice, once strong and commanding, grew faint, thin, like smoke rising into a cold sky. Servants said she would stare into the fireplace, long after the flames had died, as if she were looking at something, far beyond the stone. Doctors were called. They brought tinctures and tonics, but she refused them. Her ministers urged her to name a successor, to rest, to speak, but the Queen only shook her head. Whatever was weighing on her, it was heavier than the throne, heavier, perhaps, than life itself. By early March, it became quietly understood. Elizabeth's long reign was gently, sorrowfully coming to an end. Inside Richmond Palace, her private chambers grew dim. Once filled with laughter, music, and noble conversation, they now held only whispers and sighs. The Queen was wrapped in rich silks, but even they could not bring comfort. She no longer rode in the gardens. She no longer held council. One by one, she dismissed the women closest to her, her ladies-in-waiting. Soon, she was mostly alone. The few she allowed to remain, like Lady Scrope, spoke in quiet tones, unsure if their presence helped or hurt. It was said her mind was beginning to slip, but something more haunting, began to appear. The Queen was not sleeping. She would stand for hours, frozen like a statue by her bed, or beside the window, staring into the pale English sky. She seemed afraid to lie down, as though resting might bring death closer. And when her legs grew too weak, she would sink stiffly onto soft cushions. But even then, her eyes stayed fixed. Her lips moved in silent prayer, or perhaps in memories. There was fear in her stillness. Not just fear of dying, but fear of letting go. Of her people, her image, her power. For nearly 50 years, she had been England. And now, she faced the one thing she could not outlive. Time. Her body began to fail her. A cough took hold. Her skin turned pale. Her figure seemed to shrink within her gowns. Yet, even in sickness, she would not allow her physicians to look too closely. Her pride would not allow it. Still, one question echoed quietly through the halls. Was this just the passing of age? Or was something deeper hiding beneath her silence? Whatever the truth, Elizabeth kept it to herself. The lips that once declared war, made peace, ruled with grace and fury, now barely moved at all. To understand the quiet weight she carried in those final weeks, we must look not just at her body, but at her heart. And in that heart was the ghost of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Their bond had been complicated. He had charmed her, challenged her, disappointed her. But she had given him power. She had trusted him more than most. And when he betrayed her, when he rose in rebellion against her crown, she had been forced to do the unthinkable. She signed the order and watched him die. That act left a wound no healer could reach. Some said she carried his portrait in a locket. Others claimed they heard her whisper his name at night. We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is this. After his death, Elizabeth changed. It was not just sadness. It was guilt. A slow, silent guilt that eroded her joy and dimmed her light. In those days, grief was not well understood. What we now call depression was then spoken of as melancholia, a kind of spiritual imbalance, a cloud in the soul, a quiet sadness, too deep to name, and yet those close to her could see it. Her eyes had lost their sparkle, her laughter, once sudden and sharp, had vanished. Her steps grew slower, her silences longer. The courtiers who once jostled and smiled for her attention now moved carefully. They watched their queen with worry, not because she was angry, but because she seemed absent. She no longer signed documents, no longer wrote letters, and perhaps most startling of all, she stopped going to chapel. For a queen so devoted to her Protestant faith, this was deeply unsettling. Even God, it seemed, could not reach her in that final winter. But maybe the clearest sign of her heartbreak was her silence toward music. Elizabeth had once adored it. She had sung, played instruments with joy, and surrounded herself with musicians and poets. Music had followed her through war and peace, through love and loss. It had been her companion. Now, she asked for silence. The woman who had once danced in the glittering halls of Hampton Court, who had once written love poems to the sound of violins, now sat alone, wrapped in velvet, surrounded by silence deeper than any song. Her heart, it seemed, had broken long before her body followed. And so, as March of 1603 approached, the illusion of recovery faded. The Queen was no longer hiding her decline. It was there, for all to see. Slow, quiet, dignified, and tragic. Richmond Palace, once full of motion and ambition, slowed to stillness. The great tapestries no longer echoed with courtly debates or the footsteps of messengers. Instead, there was only a hush, a sense that something sacred was ending. Elizabeth had become still, a figure of sorrow, of history, of reverence. And though the throne stood empty in the council chamber, all knew where the true seat of power still lay, not in a crown, but in the quiet breath of a fading queen. Her body had grown thinner, her face more pale than ever before. She rarely spoke now, and when she did, her voice was barely more than a whisper. Even when asked the most important question of all, who would follow her? Who would wear the crown when she no longer could? Elizabeth hesitated. For years, the matter of succession had been dangerous to discuss. She had no children, no heir of her own blood, and though many believed that James of Scotland, the son of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was the likely choice, Elizabeth had never said it plainly. But now, in these final moments, when pressed gently and with reverence, she gave the answer. With her lips dry and her voice barely heard, she is said to have named James. Whether she spoke his name clearly, or only gave a sign with her hand, historians still debate, but those in the room understood. The Tudor line would end, and the crown would pass to the Stuarts. Not long after, she became unable to speak at all. Her breath grew slow, her skin ice cold to the touch, her eyes closed more often than open. The Queen was slipping away, not in suddenness, not in fear, but in a long, soft unraveling. One moment, one heartbeat, and then another, until there were no more. On the morning of March 24th, 1603, at Richmond Palace, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, took her final breath. She passed in her sleep, surrounded by only a few. There was no grand farewell, no final decree, just the stillness of a quiet room and the soft release of a soul that had carried the weight of a kingdom. She had ruled for 44 years, the longest of any English monarch up to that point. She had led her people through religious wars, assassinations, foreign threats and golden triumphs. She had loved and lost, fought and forgiven. She had become a legend. But in the end, she left the world as we all do, gently, alone, human. Her body was later carried to London, through streets lined with mourners in black. Thousands wept. Some bowed, some simply stood in silence, not knowing how to say goodbye, to a woman who had never truly belonged, only to herself. She had become a symbol of power, of endurance, of England itself. And yet, beneath the crown, beneath the royal robes and golden jewellery, there was always a heart that once felt joy and sorrow, a heart that, in the end, may have broken from grief more than age. Some believe she died of old age, others whisper of illness or infection, but there are those who say she died from something far quieter, something slower, the slow collapse of a soul carrying too much. And so, as we close this chapter of time, we remember Elizabeth not just as a ruler, but as a woman who carried a nation on her shoulders and laid it down only when she could carry it no more. In her final days, the once commanding sovereign now drifted through her own palace, like a silent breeze slipping through empty halls. She no longer spoke of her condition or of anything at all, her voice, once clear, now nearly absent. Questions were met with gentle nods or a slight lift of hand. Days drifted by without a single full sentence escaping her lips. Her advisors, their brows furrowed with worry, pressed her gently for guidance on matters of state, on succession, on her health. They offered petitions, reports, pleas. But Elizabeth turned away, retreating deeper into herself, as if words had grown too heavy to hold. Physicians, summoned again and again, debated her symptoms. Some spoke of humours settling, a vague Tudor diagnosis of physical and mental imbalance. Others whispered of a cold distemper of the brain, yet none could agree on a cure, because no one truly understood what was happening inside her. Her posture had become a reflection of her mind. She refused to lie down, for hours, even days. She stood, sometimes supported by cushions, sometimes gripping the arms of her chair, yet never fully reclining. It was as if to surrender to sleep was to surrender to death. When servants later recalled those hours, they described her figure, cloaked in heavy black, still in the corner of her room, unmoving for hours on end. They took turns, watching her through the night, unsure if she prayed, mourned, or simply wailed in quiet sorrow. The palace breathed in hushed tones. Courtiers spoke only in whispers. Nobles paced outside her door, waiting, lingering, anxious for word. In every corridor, the air grew heavy, thick with unspoken fear, not only of losing their queen, but of what might come after. Because the realm stood without a clear heir. For years, Elizabeth had refused to name one. Everybody suspected it would be James VI of Scotland. But without her voice, without her seal, would her will be honoured? England was no stranger to turmoil. Power struggles had long been woven into its history. Now, the Queen's silence held the nation in suspended hush, a collective breath, waiting, hoping, fearing. Amid all theories about her demise, one quiet possibility has lingered through history, not dramatic, not swift, but slow and invisible. and perhaps the cruelest of all. It was not a sword nor a poisoned chalice that claimed her life, but the very mask she wore every day, her signature white paint, Venetian ceruse, a mixture of vinegar and lead, used to achieve the pale, noble visage expected of a queen. Layer upon layer, it encased her face, a symbol of purity and power. But lead is a silent enemy, absorbed through the skin, building inch by toxic inch. It attacks the nervous system, weakens muscles, clouds the mind, kills slowly. And Elizabeth used it daily, decades of powdered paint. Beneath the beauty, the Queen suffered. All the symptoms mirrored her final days: fatigue, depression, tremors, loss of appetite, memory slipping. Her skin broke into sores, hidden beneath wigs and pearls. Her teeth blackened, fell away. Her fiery hair thinned, faded. Yet she clung to the image. The mask was her shield. Vanity, yes, but also armor. Modern historians, looking back, suggest that long-term lead exposure may have worsened her decline. The irritability, the confusion, her refusal to rest or eat, even the deep sorrow after Robert Devereux's death, may have been magnified by a mind poisoned from within. But in her time, no one saw the danger. Ceruse was celebrated, imported, admired, unrecognized as poison. The very product that made her iconic may have been the slow unraveling of the woman beneath. By the second week of March, 1603, her condition became impossible to ignore. Courtiers moved carefully, with urgent steps, but they kept calm facades, afraid to stir panic. She had stopped eating entirely. Her frail form seemed to sink deeper into her gowns. Bones pressed hard against fabric, her body retreating, folding, shrinking. Tudor medicine had no tools, no instruments of precision, no thermometers, no microscopes, no knowledge of infection. Illness was humoral and treated with bleeding, purging, herbal waters. They tried everything to rebalance her, but none of it worked, because the cause remained hidden. Modern scholars propose she may have contracted pneumonia. That cold palace air, combined with fasting and standing, could have led to a lung infection, chills, cough, delirium. In the age before penicillin, even mild pneumonia could be fatal. Others suspect blood poisoning, perhaps from abscessed teeth or ulcers beneath her cosmetics. Unchecked, infection travels, enters the bloodstream, becomes septicemia. But in her day, there were no diagnoses, only speculation. Her physicians tried tinctures, warmed compresses, prayers, but she rejected them all, refused to be bled, to remove her clothing, guarded modesty to the final hour, and fell silent. Her silence became part of her illness. Servants tiptoed, ladies wept in quiet. Ministers watched in helpless sorrow as their queen, once strong and radiant, faded, not in crisis, but like a candle, its thriftly flame, slowly extinguished in calm despair. No one could stop it, no one knew how, so they simply waited for the end, or a miracle. But there was more than illness within her room. There was the weight, the loneliness, the crown she had carried. For 44 years, she had breathed royalty, lived monarchy, embodied England. But in her chamber, the crown lay aside, heavy, unclaimed. Even as she prepared to lay down, herself, the realm, faced its unknown future. No clear successor, no whispered guidance. For decades, she had refused to name one, because to name would be to admit she might die. And perhaps that truth she could not bear. James of Scotland was not just obvious, he was necessary. Protestant, from royal blood. Kate Tudor's great-grandson. Yet factions stirred, religious upheavals festered, foreign powers watched. So, ministers pressed, Robert Cecil urged. But the Queen kept silent. Some whisper she nodded, others say she murmured disdain. There is no record. The Queen of stirring speeches, boundless eloquence, would not speak. Not now. Acknowledging a successor might have felt like admitting her own end. As March wore on, the hours turned cold, darker, and Elizabeth refused sleep completely. Day and night melded into one long vigil. Some say she feared letting go. In Tudor belief, Sleep was a semi-death, an act that could call forth the soul, never to return. So she stood, hunched, leaning, not sleeping, her legs swollen, breaths shallow, but she would not rest. Servants offered comfort, music, food, gentle words, but she gently refused, her will unbroken. She was standing, watching, waiting for that which would come, inevitably. Eventually, her legs failed her. She collapsed beside her chair, silent, resolute, refusing to cry out. After that, her ladies-in-waiting remained ever near, hovering like guardians, but they did not speak, unless she did first. And then, finally, exhaustion took her. She allowed herself to be carried to her bed, gently placed, as though a fragile treasure, lowered into alabaster sheets, covered in silence, reverence, love. The moment she lay, the chamber shifted. The air grew denser, sacred, because it was the beginning of the end. In those final hours, the room stayed quiet, not by decree, but by instinct. No one dared disturb her, not with voices, not with movement, only the soft crackle of logs in the hearth and the occasional wind brushing against the windows. She lay there, eyes half closed, her breath shallow, almost imperceptible, each one slower than the last, a rhythm, like waves, gently leaving the shore. Around her stood those who had shared decades of loyalty, ladies who had dressed her, servants who had waited through her silence, counselors who had once sought her guidance. Now, they said nothing, because there were no words. Some wept quietly, not out of fear, but reverence. They were witnessing the passing, not just of a monarch, but of an era, the end of something sacred, something rare. Her mind, if it still wandered, may have returned to other times. The garden of her childhood at Hatfield, the long shadows in the tower, the moment she heard of Mary's death, her coronation robes, heavy but thrilling, or the day her armada scattered Spain's power into the sea. Perhaps she saw Robert Dudley once again, the man she called her spirit. Perhaps she stood in thought beside his empty shoes, left at her bedside so long ago, a love never spoken in full, yet always understood. Perhaps she relived the sound of her people, cheering her name, their Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of a nation. But now, her body grew colder. Her skin no longer took the paint. The famed mask, no longer necessary. It is said, a bishop was summoned to pray. He knelt beside her, murmuring the words of psalm and promise, that Christ walks with us through the valley, that there is no death, only peace beyond the veil. Still, she did not stir. She had left speaking long ago, and now, even her stillness deepened. In the early hours of March 24th, 1603, with the stars still hanging in the black above, and the lamps burning low in the palace halls, she slipped away. No final speech, no dramatic last breath, only stillness, so gentle, it was as if she had only fallen asleep. They checked. Once, then twice. The great queen was gone. 44 years of reign ended in a quiet breath. A whisper travelled through the palace, then across the city, then the country. Elizabeth is dead. A sorrow, deep and wide, washed through England. For many, she was the only monarch they had ever known. She had ruled from the cradle of their memories into their grey years, and yet, even in her passing, she had left behind a legacy of peace. Within hours, her council moved to proclaim James of Scotland, now James the First of England, a union of crowns, quietly ushered in. No war, no blood, just the stillness of a monarch's end, and the dawn of something new. Her body was prepared with reverence. The Queen would lie in state, dressed in cloth of gold, her face calm, her hands gently folded. People would come from miles, just to pass her by, to bow, to weep, to whisper goodbye. and on her coffin they placed the effigy, not of a fading woman, but of a queen in full regalia, crown atop her head, orb and sceptre in hand, as if, even in death, she ruled still. The funeral procession was long, winding through London's streets. Thousands came, peasants, nobles, children, elders, all stood as bells tolled and drums beat slow, the sound of mourning wrapped in pageantry. White horses drew the hearse, black drapery hung from every pole and window, priests chanted, choirs sang, and the air was filled with the weight of goodbye. Some said they felt the very soul of England walking with her, a spirit passing from body to memory to myth. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, not far from her half-sister, Mary, in a shared tomb, 2 queens, 2 beliefs, 1 history, and above them the inscription would read, "Consorts both in throne and grave, here rest 2 royal sisters." Yet Elizabeth would never be just a sister. She would be an icon, a legend, the woman who chose to marry her people, who held power in a man's world, who outlived her rivals and died without ever giving in. What truly claimed her life remains unsolved. Was it grief, lead poisoning, infection, weariness, or was it simply the soft closing of a great chapter? Whatever it was, it came not as a thief, but as an old friend, and she walked into it on her own terms. The shadow of old successions still lingered, a quiet tension held in the air. For England remembered well how crowns could pass in blood, and yet, this time, there was no uprising, no power struggle, because even in silence, the Queen's Council had prepared. Within hours of her final breath, the decision was clear. James the Sixth of Scotland would now become James the First of England. A new line had begun, the Tudor sun had set, and the Stuart moon had risen. But even as the country looked to the horizon, it did so with mourning in its eyes. For they had lost, not just a monarch, but a woman who had shaped the very rhythm of their world, a symbol whose absence felt impossibly large. Elizabeth had worn the crown for so long that to imagine England without her felt like waking without the sky. Now, their attention turned to her body, to the woman beneath the crown, to the flesh and bone that once carried so much weight. In life, she had guarded her image with iron resolve. It was not vanity alone, it was strategy. To be seen as flawless was to remain untouchable. To show weakness was to invite ruin. She wore her face like armor, white lead makeup, powdered thick, hair bright and burning, even when her own had faded, gowns of silk, stitched with symbols of power. Each day, she dressed not as a woman, but as a nation. Even as death crept closer, she kept her chambers dim, refusing most visitors. She would not let them see what time had done, because in a court of whispers and knives, the smallest crack could shatter everything. But now, there was nothing left to hide. When her ladies began to gently prepare her, they peeled back the layers of illusion, and beneath it they found a human being. Her skin, bruised and brittle, small sores scattered like forgotten regrets. A pallor, not from death, but from years of toxic powders. The very paint that gave her power had also taken something from her. Her hands, once draped in gold and rings, were thin, bony, delicate. Her hair had turned wispy and pale. The bright wigs long set aside, the mask, both literal and symbolic, had slipped. She had been dying, long before she let the world see it. And yet, there was something strangely beautiful in this final truth. She was no longer Gloriana, no longer the untouchable Virgin Queen, no longer the face on coins and paintings. She was a woman who had ruled alone, who had walked through fire, who had lived without a husband or an heir, who had carried a kingdom on her shoulders and paid for it with her body. And that was not weakness, that was strength, quiet, unshakable, real. Her body was not embalmed immediately. That was the tradition, not out of neglect but out of reverence. There would be time for the nation to mourn, time for the ceremony to be planned and perfected. And so, her body lay in state, dressed one final time, in robes of royal crimson, crown set gently upon her brow, orb and sceptre placed at her side. A queen, even in silence. And the people came. They filed through the dark halls, moving slowly, whispering prayers, gazing, not just at a sovereign, but at the soul she had left behind. They did not weep for the image. They wept for the woman, for all her contradictions, her loneliness, her fierce pride, her quiet grief, her brilliance and burden, her power and her pain. The mask was gone, but what remained was not less, it was more human, more sacred, more true. Then came April 28th, 1603. More than a month had passed since that quiet morning when she had slipped into stillness. The delay was not hesitation, it was care, because the loss of England's longest reigning monarch deserved something worthy of the story she had lived. The funeral procession began at Whitehall and moved slowly toward the hallowed walls of Westminster Abbey. Thousands lined the streets, from nobles to common folk, men and women, children who had only known one queen, elders who had grown old beneath her reign. There were no cheers, no songs, only bells and silence and the soft sound of boots on stone. The coffin was draped in velvet, deep and regal, drawn by 4 white horses, step after solemn step, and upon the coffin sat the effigy, a likeness of Elizabeth, dressed in robes of state, crown on her head, orb and sceptre in her hands, eyes open, face calm, as if still watching, still guarding, still reigning. Some believed it was her, not a statue, but her real body, propped upright in eternal vigilance. Behind the hearse marched the honour guard, nobles of her court, parliamentarians, ambassadors from lands near and far. Each footfall echoed with the end of an age. She was not the only one being buried. An entire era, the golden heart of a kingdom, was being laid to rest at Westminster. They lowered her into the vault, beside her half-sister, Mary, a woman with whom she had once clashed, in faith, in rule, in destiny, but now they rested, side by side. Above their tomb, an inscription was etched in stone. Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection. The irony was not forgotten. In life, they were rivals. In death, they were companions. And with that, the Tudor line ended. A new age had begun. But England would never forget the woman who reigned like no other. As the echoes of her funeral faded, a hush remained over England. The people moved slowly, as if unsure of how to live without her still presence. And yet, life surged onward. James, once King of Scots, was now James I of England. A new dynasty had begun, quietly, deliberately, beneath the weight of grief. The court reformed in whispers and paper. Robes were refitted, seals transferred, heralds spread the word. In this sombre transition, there were no shouts of triumph, only the attentive hush of history in motion. But beneath the solemnity, there was a fragile hope that the unity she had carved out might hold, that peace might continue, that 2 kingdoms, once separate, now would share a future. For Elizabeth, the union of crowns may have been the dream she never spoke aloud, a bridge between past and future, held together by a silence more powerful than any speech. As for her legacy, it reached far beyond palaces and parliaments. Her poems and letters still carried warmth. Her speeches remained woven into the English tongue. The arts she championed, performers and painters cherished. The voyages she commissioned, explorers followed to distant shores. She had shaped more than kingdoms. She had shaped culture, language, even imagination. Yet, beneath that enduring influence lay the fragile truth of humanity. She was mortal, fragile to illness, vulnerable to sorrow. Even the mighty must bow to time. And in death, she reminded her people of that, of the beauty and grief, of being alive, of an age ruled with strength, ending with grace. In the weeks that followed, the nation found moments to honour her memory. Commemorations in halls and homes, prayers said by candlelight, small acts of remembrance, scattered through daily life. She had been the heart, and now she was its echo. Countries beyond England also reflected on her passing. Allies, foes, scholars, writers. Many saw in her reign the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Even France, once her enemy, acknowledged her significance. Her diplomats paid tribute. Poets versified her leadership. A continent bowed in quiet respect. Her funeral tapestry would be studied for centuries. Her legacy, argued over in libraries and parliaments. Her face, remembered, idealized, immortalized. Yet even as statues and portraits were made, all who knew her knew this was not the whole truth. The woman behind the legend, who bore pain and loneliness, who carried guilt, who lost and loved, who used power but felt the cost. That was the story hidden beneath the pageantry, and perhaps that hidden story is what held the greatest magic, because it reminded us that even the strongest must rest, that grief can linger, that beauty can fade, that strength can be broken, but also that those same hearts can live on, in verse, in lore, in art, in memory. She became a ghost in her own halls, not of fear, but of inspiration. In classrooms and courts, her name carried meaning. Her reign served as mirror and caution. She embodied the price of power, the cost of solitude, the grace of perseverance. We do not know the true cause of her death. Perhaps it was simply time. Perhaps lead poured through her skin day after day. Perhaps a hidden infection, pneumonia. Perhaps grief, silent and deep, consumed her. We may never fully know. But in that mystery, there is space to remember her as more than a queen, as a woman, full of contradictions, soft yet strong, isolated yet enduring, powerful yet mortal. And in the end, that is what makes her story still matter. After Elizabeth was laid to rest beside her half-sister Mary, the silence of the tomb whispered of more than death. It whispered of time. Two queens, once enemies in life, now lay side by side in the quiet dark, their rivalry stilled by the dust of centuries. One Protestant, one Catholic, both daughters of Henry VIII, both shaped and broken by the crown they wore. Above them, the carved stone bore a message meant to soften the weight of their history. Partners in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection. It was a sentence not just of peace, but of longing, for reconciliation, for rest, for a world in which conflict could dissolve and only humanity remained. Elizabeth had ruled alone, but she would not sleep alone. And as the new king, James I, settled into power, England itself entered a twilight, a moment between eras. The Tudors were no more. An age had closed its eyes. What followed would be different, not worse, not better, but changed. Elizabeth's England was gone, and yet not entirely, because some spirits do not vanish, they remain. In language, in law, in art, in memory, they remain. When a girl picks up a pen to write her first poem, when a young leader studies strength without cruelty, when someone stands alone but does not crumble, these are the places where Elizabeth I still lives. She is not the white mask or the red wig, not just the coin or crown. She is the ache in legacy, the echo in power, the quiet in endurance. Even now, centuries later, if you listen carefully, past the pages of history books, past the noise of modern life, you may still hear it. That hush, that pause, that breath between sentences. It is the breath she once held when faced with impossible choices. It is the breath the nation held when she passed. And it is the breath we now release in memory, not just of the monarch, but of the woman, Elizabeth. a flame that flickered for 45 years and went out, slowly, softly, leaving the night just a little brighter because she had once burned there. With Elizabeth gone, the bloodline that had carried England from the Wars of the Roses into an age of wonder had come to an end. The great doors of Westminster Abbey closed not just upon a coffin, but upon a chapter of history. A kingdom changed at its core. The Elizabethan age had quietly come to rest. What came next would be shaped by a different hand, beneath a different crown. More than 4 centuries now stand between us and her final sigh. Yet the gentle mystery still whispers across time. Her decline, draped in silence, secrets and contradictions, continues to draw our curiosity. Scholars and seekers still debate what claimed her. First, the simplest, most human explanation: old age. At nearly 70, a rare age in her time, her body endured decades of rule, loss, sacrifice. The refusal to eat, to sleep, to rest, and the lack of modern medicine could have sent a frail body into decline. Another possible cause: pneumonia. A chill, caught in the damp shadows of Richmond Palace, rose up her chest, settled into her lungs. Cold air, fasting, long hours standing, a cough, fever, delirium. Without antibiotics, such infections could be fatal, even mercifully swift. Yet another theory, more insidious: lead poisoning. The mask she wore, Venetian ceruse, a beauty ritual mixed with white lead, once proud symbols, carried hidden cost. Years of painting her face, slowly absorbed, damaging organs, clouding the mind, draining strength. The signs are there: fatigue, irritability, memory lost, skin cracking under paint, hair thinning, teeth failing, all echoes of slow poisoning. Then there is blood poisoning. An infected tooth or open sore could have spread unseen into her bloodstream. A silent killer. Septicemia tortured many before science could heal, and still, beneath all physical causes, there was sorrow, profound grief, from lost loves, dear friends, confidants. The death of Devereux shattered her heart, its echo in her sleepless nights, her withdrawn silence, her broken will. Perhaps it was all of these: age, illness, poison, grief, entwined like vines tightening around her. A queen who once carried an empire finally bent under its weight. She revealed no confession, she left no final words, only silence, which became legend. Her death was not just the end of a life, but the shedding of a state, an identity that had shaped 4 decades of England's story. She had ruled, without spouse, without child. She had carved her image into poetry, language, even the soil of her country. Her passing, quiet, private, full of mysteries, echoed loud across centuries. The England she left behind was transformed. When she ascended, in 1558, religious wars raged, foreign empires threatened, the realm trembled. In the years she reigned, she commanded, not by fear, but by presence. She unified, inspired, lit a flame of identity and culture. From fair words to naval victories, from plays to poems, England found its voice. But in her death, the fragile foundations showed. Her successor, James I, arrived under a shadow. A peaceful transition, yes, but also a tectonic shift. The Tudor star had set, the Stuart dawn, uncertain. Yet, beyond politics, what lingered most was Elizabeth's persona, her words at Tilbury, her unbending choice to remain married to the kingdom, the regal image of the Virgin Queen, and her famous crimson gowns and high foreheads. These became myth. Her silence became part of that myth. She performed, even in dying. The final act was silence, a gesture as powerful as any speech. And today, historians still search, but none doubt her legacy. Her age is a golden era. Her name, shorthand for art, exploration, national pride. Though her body rests beneath cold stone, her story courses through pages, stages, echoes of monarchy. She died alone, but she was not forgotten. Long before chocolate wrapped itself in sweetness, before it became comfort on rainy days, or celebration in gold foil, cacao held a very different place in the hearts of those who first discovered it. It was not sweet, and it was not eaten. It was something sacred, something strong, something to be drunk, bitter, frothy, powerful. Among the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Olmec, the Aztec, cacao was more than just a drink. It was spirit, it was currency, it was blood. The beans, plucked from their pods like jewels, were dried, roasted, ground by hand, and then whisked with water until a thick, foamy elixir emerged, sometimes spiced, sometimes spattered with chili, always respected. To drink cacao was to consume strength. To share cacao was to exchange trust. To offer cacao was to speak to the gods. It was a part of weddings, of rituals, of farewells. A soldier might drink it before battle. A priest might sip it before sacrifice. And in royal courts, cacao was served in golden goblets. Its bitter taste, a mark of power. The Maya believed the cacao tree was a divine gift, a bridge between earth and the heavens. And its beans were so prized, they were used as money. A rabbit might cost 10 beans, a turkey, 100, a slave, even more. The Aztecs told stories of the god Quetzalcoatl, who brought cacao from paradise and taught humans to grind and prepare it. But they also warned, this drink was not for the weak. In their world, cacao was not comfort, it was challenge. It was a dark mirror, reflecting status, ceremony, and spirit. Centuries would pass before cacao softened into sweetness, before sugar would tame its bitter edge, before it would fill mugs rather than altars. But in those early days, cacao carried memory, belief, and meaning. Our story continues as we go back over 3,000 years ago, deep within the lush, humid rainforests of what is now southern Mexico. There, the Olmec people, one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas, likely first nurtured the cacao tree. Though much of their history remains veiled in mystery, archaeologists believe the Olmec used cacao in sacred rituals. It was no ordinary drink. It was a vessel of spiritual power, a gift from the earth, held close by shamans and leaders. But it was with the Maya civilization that cacao blossomed into something truly divine. Spanning much of Central America between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya worshipped cacao as a sacred plant, a gift bestowed by the gods themselves. According to their myths, cacao was part of the very fabric of life. The Pulvu, a sacred Maya text, tells of gods forming humans from maize and cacao, binding humankind forever to nature and spirit. Cacao was reserved for moments that mattered most. Priests offered it in solemn ceremonies. Nobles drank it during grand feasts. It was believed to enliven the spirit and open a gateway to the divine. Served cold, mixed with chili, spices, or ground maize, the cacao drink was rich, intense, and energizing. Often it was poured from vessel to vessel, a ritual that created a frothy foam, a mark of prestige and excellence. But cacao's value ran deeper than ceremony. In Maya markets, cacao beans were currency. A handful could buy a tamale. 100 beans might buy a turkey. People stored and traded cacao like precious coins, even crafting counterfeit beans from clay. For the Maya, chocolate was not a treat. It was life, power, wealth, worship, all in one. It was the drink of gods, coursing through the veins of kings and priests alike. Its bitter, intoxicating flavor marked the beginning of a remarkable culinary and cultural journey. Among the Maya, cacao was far more than a beverage. It was a living symbol of divine order, woven deeply into daily life and cosmic belief. This small bitter bean from the jungle was sacred, a substance believed to connect mortals with gods, earth, and the afterlife. In every major Maya city, from Tikal to Copan, cacao was present at life's most important moments. When rulers were crowned, cacao was poured. When marriages were sealed, bride and groom drank it together. And when the dead were laid to rest, vessels of cacao accompanied them into the tomb, offerings meant to nourish souls on their journey beyond. Cacao was a staple of religious ceremony, especially among priests and the elite. These drinks were never sweet or casual. They were blended with chili peppers, maize, vanilla, and sometimes even blood, a potent mix intended to invigorate the spirit and induce visions. Drinking cacao was thought to bring one closer to the divine, opening the mind to prophecy, sacred insight. The cacao tree itself was sacred. Its curved branches and brightly coloured pods symbolized life, fertility, and abundance. In Maya art, cacao appeared alongside gods and ancestral spirits. Painted ceramics and carved stone often depict kings offering cacao to deities, or gods emerging from cacao pods, as if born of divine fruit. But cacao's role extended beyond religion. It shaped the social and economic fabric of Maya life. Hosting a guest meant serving cacao. Negotiating peace meant drinking cacao together. To share cacao was to recognize shared humanity, an unspoken contract of trust, respect, and elevated purpose. Even in wealthy homes, cacao drinking was ceremonial. Special vessels, beautifully painted cups marked with glyphs, told stories of ownership and purpose. These were not mere dishes, but heirlooms crafted with care and reverence. Reverence for cacao shaped the Maya identity. It was not simply consumed, it was celebrated, revered, trusted as a bridge between worlds. In a cosmos ruled by ritual and cycles, cacao was the drink that kept the universe in balance. Centuries later, another mighty civilization would rise, elevating cacao even further: the Aztecs. By the time Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, cacao had become more than ritual or luxury in the Aztec Empire. It was an institution used as money, medicine, and royal indulgence. The Aztecs did not grow cacao in the cool climate of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Instead, it flowed in from conquered southern provinces, tribute sent in beans. Tons of beans filled granaries, their value stored like gold in vaults. Each bean had worth. 10 beans might buy a small rabbit, 100 beans, a turkey hen. Servants earned cacao wages. Debts settled in beans. To counterfeit a bean, hollow it and fill it with dirt, was a grave crime. In Aztec society, cacao was as valuable as gold, but it meant far more than wealth. Known as socoatl, it was a warrior's drink, consumed only by nobles, priests, and military leaders, never by commoners. Prepared with water, chili, and sometimes maize, it was believed to sharpen the mind and energize the body before battle. Emperor Moctezuma II is said to have drunk as many as 50 cups a day, believing it an aphrodisiac and source of strength. Cacao was central to religious ceremony. Offerings were made to gods like Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who legend says stole cacao from paradise and gave it to humanity. To drink cacao properly was a sacred act. In Aztec culture, cacao was wealth, war, worship, and royalty, a seed of power earned, stolen, traded, and honored. But all of this would soon collide with a new world. When European eyes first saw cacao beans, their value was not yet clear, but that would change. The bitter drink of warriors and kings was about to cross an ocean, where it would be transformed, sweetened, commodified, and woven into a global obsession. When Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors marched into Tenochtitlan in 1519, they encountered wonders beyond imagination. Temples soaring skyward, floating gardens, bustling markets. Among the marvels was the strange, dark drink made from crushed beans. The Spanish watched Moctezuma II sip cup after cup of socoatl, served in golden vessels. Warriors, nobles, priests, all treated the drink with reverence. At first, the Spaniards found it strange, bitter, even unpalatable, but they saw its power, the energy it granted, the sharpness it sparked, the deep symbolic meaning in every corner of Aztec life. When the empire fell, Cortés brought more than gold and silver back to Spain. He brought cacao beans, and the knowledge of how to prepare and drink them. In Europe, cacao remained an exotic treasure for the courts and monasteries, but European tastes were different. Slowly the Chilean maize gave way to something new: sugar. Sugar changed everything. Sweetness transformed the bitter cacao drink. What had been a sacred, spicy brew became a seductive luxury. In Spain and across Europe, chocolate became a marker of wealth and refinement. Aristocrats sipped it in salons, royalty demanded it at their tables. Still a drink, usually served hot, its flavour softened. Rituals gave way to recipes. The power once held by gods and warriors now belonged to European elites. But beneath the sweetness lay a bitter truth. To feed Europe's growing hunger for cacao and sugar, plantations expanded, and behind them, a brutal system of exploitation took root. Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonial powers built plantation economies fueled by enslaved labor. Millions of Africans were captured, shipped across the Atlantic, forced into brutal toil on cacao and sugar plantations. Many never tasted the sweetness their labor produced. Families torn apart, cultures erased, generations broken. Yet in London, Paris, and Madrid, the wealthy sipped hot chocolate, often unaware or indifferent to the suffering behind the beans. Cacao's transformation marked a turning point. No longer sacred, it was now a global commodity, traded, taxed, exploited. As the industrial age dawned, demand only grew. What began as a sacred, revered drink had become entangled in empire and oppression. The taste that once symbolized divine connection left behind a bitter legacy, one of blood, suffering, and systemic injustice. Still, the allure of chocolate deepened. Its ties to luxury, love, and pleasure only grew stronger. While the history of pain lay buried beneath layers of sugar and cream, the story of chocolate's rise was no longer just about flavor or ritual. It was a story of power, profit, and the people sacrificed along the way. For centuries, chocolate remained a liquid luxury in royal courts and elegant salons. But as Europe entered the Industrial Revolution, chocolate was about to undergo yet another transformation, one that would forever change its form, its audience, and its place in the world. In the early 1800s, the world was changing. Machines and factories were beginning to reshape how things were made. Everything, from clothes to food, was starting to be produced faster and in larger amounts. It was a time of invention and discovery. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Conrad Johannes van Houten made an important discovery. He found a way to take the natural fat called cocoa butter out of roasted cacao beans using a strong press. After pressing, what was left was a dry cake. This dry cake could be ground into a fine powder. This powder was special. It mixed easily with water and could blend smoothly with sugar. This made chocolate cheaper and lighter, easier to make than before. This new powder became known as Dutch cocoa. It changed chocolate forever. Years later, in 1847, a British company called Fry & Sons took chocolate a step further. They mixed cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and sugar. This created the first solid chocolate bar. Before this, chocolate was only a drink. But now, for the first time, chocolate could be held in the hand, carried easily, and enjoyed as a solid treat. This was a quiet revolution. Then the Swiss came along in the 1870s with their own ideas. Daniel Peter added condensed milk to the chocolate mixture. This made chocolate creamier and sweeter. Around the same time, his friend Rodolphe Lindt invented a machine called the conking machine. This machine churned the chocolate slowly for hours. It smoothed out the texture and gave chocolate the silky feel we love today. These changes transformed chocolate from a luxury for the rich into a treat for many. Chocolate shops, factories, and lunchboxes began to fill with this new sweet. Companies like Cadbury, Nestle, and Hershey started making chocolate on a large scale. Colourful packaging and joyful advertising made chocolate feel like a special joy, a small delight for children and adults alike. But in becoming sweeter and more common, chocolate lost some of its old meaning. Once a sacred drink, treasured by ancient cultures, chocolate became just a snack. It was delicious, yes, but its old power and mystery faded. Still, a new story was beginning. Chocolate was becoming a beloved part of everyday life all over the world. By the early 1900s, chocolate was everywhere. It was no longer just a delicacy. It had become a huge industry. Factories hummed with activity, shipping chocolate to shops and homes far and wide. In America, Milton Hershey changed chocolate forever. Like Henry Ford with cars, Hershey used machines to make milk chocolate affordable for the average person. His factory in Pennsylvania created the famous Hershey bar, and a new American love for chocolate blossomed. Chocolate soon became more than food. Soldiers carried it to war. Children traded it on playgrounds. It appeared in cookbooks and holiday traditions. Valentine's Day, Halloween, Easter, all claimed chocolate as part of their celebrations. The sweetness came to represent love, comfort, and happy memories. Meanwhile, far away in West Africa, cacao farming was growing fast. Countries like Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire became centers for growing cacao beans. These places had once suffered under colonial rule and slavery. Now they supplied over 70% of the world's cacao. But the work was often hard and unfair. Many farmers lived in poverty, and some children still worked on cacao farms. Even today, these problems continue. Despite these difficulties, chocolate's popularity grew everywhere. In Japan, chocolate became a refined art, with small, perfect bonbons given as gifts with care. In Switzerland, brands like Toblerone and Lindt became symbols of quality. In Mexico, chocolate returned to its roots in traditional dishes like mole, where bitter and savory flavors mix. Chocolate's story is full of contrasts. It is global yet personal. It began as a sacred ritual in ancient forests, then was shaped by empires and industry. Now it lives in many forms across continents and cultures. From the Andes to Antwerp, from Ghana to Geneva, chocolate is part of our shared human story. But how often do we pause to think about where chocolate really comes from? Every bite carries a history, sweet, bitter, and complex. As the world grew and factories spread, chocolate's old stories were mostly forgotten. What was once sacred became just a treat, easy to find and buy by the millions. But in recent years, a quiet awakening has begun. People have started to remember the true origins of chocolate. In the early 2000s, the craft chocolate movement took shape. Inspired by similar trends in coffee and wine, artisans began asking questions. Where does our chocolate come from? Who grows the beans? What does chocolate taste like before sugar and additives cover it up? Their answers led back to the cacao bean itself. Unlike mass-produced chocolate, which blends beans from many places, craft chocolate focuses on single origins. Each place gives cacao a unique flavor. Beans from Madagascar might taste fruity and bright. Beans from Ecuador might have floral or nutty notes. Chocolate, like wine, has terroir, the taste of the soil, the sun, and the care taken in growing and fermenting the beans. This return to origins was about more than flavor. It was about fairness and respect. Documentaries revealed the harsh realities faced by many cacao farmers: child labor, low wages, and poor conditions. Craft makers began working directly with farmers, paying them fairly for their high-quality beans. New labels like Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance appeared, aiming to make chocolate production more just and sustainable. Chefs and historians also helped bring ancient chocolate traditions back to life. In Mexico and Guatemala, traditional cacao drinks made with chili and maize grew popular again. Indigenous recipes, passed down for generations, reminded the world that chocolate was born in the forest, not in factories. Today, museums, books, and culinary tours celebrate chocolate's rich heritage. Chocolate is no longer just candy. It is culture, history, and story. Even though the world has changed, chocolate, the essence, remains. It is still the fruit of a tree, grown by hand, made with care, and shared with meaning. For those who listen, chocolate speaks again, not just with sweetness, but with memory. Now, chocolate is everywhere. At celebrations, in vending machines, in bakeries and fine restaurants. It is a symbol of love, luxury, and comfort. But beneath its creamy surface lies a history that is anything but simple. It is a story of gods and empires, of joy and hardship, of ritual and reinvention. Chocolate, perhaps more than any other food, reflects the story of humanity itself. From sacred ceremonies of ancient peoples to the pain of colonization, from the hands of enslaved workers to the halls of European nobility, from soldiers' rations to holiday treats, chocolate has traveled with us, changing as we changed. Its legacy is layered. On one side, it is a story of creativity, strength, and blending cultures. Ingredients from one land meet techniques from another, creating something new. Chocolate inspires art, science, and innovation. But on the other side, there is shadow. Many farmers still struggle, never tasting the chocolate made from their beans. Problems like deforestation and child labor continue. Chocolate also holds many forgotten voices. The indigenous peoples who first loved cacao saw it as sacred. Their stories, silenced by history, are now being heard again. Each time we taste chocolate, a truffle or a cup of cocoa, we connect to this deep and often difficult past. And yet, for all its contradictions, chocolate continues to bring people together. It comforts us, makes us happy, and marks our celebrations. It endures. Perhaps that is its greatest gift. Not just flavor, but the ability to change and survive through time. From ritual to recipe, from seed to symbol, chocolate has always been more than just a treat. It is a story, one that we continue to write today. In the early years of the 1800s, America was still young. It was a country growing quickly, always reaching for more. Its towns were filling up, new families were arriving, and many white settlers felt hungry for land, gold, and all the chances they believed waited for them. They looked to the west. They saw it as empty land, open for them to take, but it was not empty. These places were already home to many people. They were the lands of Native American nations. Among these nations were the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. These were not wandering groups without roots. They had strong communities. They had governments, laws, and schools. Some even printed newspapers. The Cherokee people had built a government much like America's. They wrote a constitution. They farmed the land. Many even became Christians. They hoped that by becoming more like white Americans, they could stay on their land in peace. They printed a newspaper in both Cherokee and English. They sent leaders to Washington, trying to protect their home through law and agreement. But for many white settlers and leaders, this was never enough. What they wanted was the land itself. Soon, the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi began pushing harder into native lands. They made new laws that ignored native governments. They took away native rights to own property. They pressed the US government to step in. Then, gold was found in northern Georgia. That made everything move faster. Many white people said the land was simply too rich, too precious to belong to Native Americans. President Andrew Jackson, once a general who fought against native nations, brought an answer. He wanted to clear the east of all native tribes. He planned to move them far across the Mississippi River. There, he said, they would no longer be in the way of white farmers and cotton plantations. This was more than just a plan. It was a deep belief. Many Americans thought it was their right to spread from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. They called it destiny. They believed God wanted them to fill the land, no matter who already lived there. And so, in the 1830s, this idea crushed entire native nations. On May 28, 1830, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This law changed everything. It promised that native tribes could trade their lands in the east for land farther west. It said this would be fair and peaceful. It claimed it would protect native people from harm by moving them away from white settlers. But in truth, it was about taking land. Andrew Jackson believed that native people could not live side by side with white settlers. He said they did not have the same habits, the same learning, or the same will to improve. He claimed they must either disappear or move far away. The law barely passed. In the Senate, it won by just 3 votes. In the House of Representatives, by only 5. Yet these slim votes were enough to begin one of the saddest chapters in America's story. Some tribes agreed to leave, hoping to avoid war. Others held on, trusting promises that they would be given money, food, and safe passage. But most of these promises would later break. In reality, removal was harsh and filled with pain. Agreements were ignored. Bribes and lies were common. Soldiers came to homes and told families they must leave. Settlers stood waiting to take the empty land. This did not just change maps, it broke bonds with sacred land. It destroyed lives. It showed that America's growth was built not only on hope, but on deep sorrow. While many tribes felt forced to sign removal treaties, the Cherokee tried another way. They did not pick up weapons. Instead, they turned to the courts, to the very laws that were being used against them. Their chief, John Ross, led them. The Cherokee wrote a constitution. They made a formal government. They showed that they were a real nation inside America's borders. They hoped this would protect them. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1831, in a case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, they asked the court to stop Georgia from taking their land, but the court said the Cherokee were not a foreign country, and so could not bring the case. It was a heavy blow. But the next year, hope returned. In Worcester versus Georgia, the court said Georgia had no right to pass laws over Cherokee land. Only the US government could deal with native nations. For a short time, it seemed justice had won. President Jackson, though, would not listen. It is said he replied, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he truly spoke these words or not, his actions showed he would ignore the court. Georgia kept taking Cherokee land. Still, the Cherokee tried not to sign removal treaties, but a small group within them, led by Major Ridge, John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, believed they had no choice. In 1835, they signed the Treaty of New Echota without the approval of the Cherokee government. The Senate approved the treaty by only one vote, but that was enough. The Cherokee were now bound by it. Their long fight ended not with a court's hammer, but with the sound of soldiers preparing to march. In the spring of 1838, the time for talk was over. President Martin Van Buren, who came after Jackson, ordered thousands of soldiers and state militias to Cherokee land. The treaty, signed by only a small Cherokee group, had been approved by Congress. Now it would be enforced by force. Across Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, soldiers arrived at Cherokee homes. They carried guns with bayonets fixed. They had orders to clear the land. Families were often given only moments to pack what they could carry. Many left with little more than the clothes on their backs. Their houses were searched, then looted. Food stores were taken or ruined. Fields of crops were left to rot. Churches and schools stood empty. Burial grounds were abandoned, the graves of ancestors left behind. More than 16,000 Cherokee were gathered up and put into makeshift camps. These stockades were crowded and dirty. There was not enough clean water. There was not enough food. There was no shelter from the sun or rain. Disease spread quickly. Measles, dysentery, whooping cough. These swept through the camps even before the march began. People grew weak and died in these pens, waiting for the long road west. Some groups were forced to leave right away. Others stayed in the hot, stifling camps through the summer, waiting until fall, when soldiers decided travel would be easier. But autumn brought cold rain and early snow. The journey would become even more cruel. The Cherokee called this path Nunadultsuni, which means the trail where they cried. It stretched roughly 1,200 miles from their old homeland to the new land called Indian Territory, a place that would later be called Oklahoma. The walk was slow. It was harsh. It was filled with heartbreak. They moved through thick mud, over icy rivers, across hard mountains and endless plains. Old people stumbled and could not rise again. Children shivered with fever and died in their mother's arms. Entire families vanished along the trail. When someone died, there was no time for ceremony. They were laid in shallow graves by the roadside, with little more than a whispered prayer. Yet even in this pain, many tried to hold on to dignity. They sang soft prayers. They carried sacred objects close to their hearts. Some tried to keep lists of the names of those who were lost, hoping they would not be forgotten. But grief pressed down like a heavy stone. Hunger gnawed at their bodies. Cold cut through their thin clothes. The soldiers who guarded them often showed no kindness. When at last the final groups reached Indian Territory in early 1839, more than 4,000 Cherokee were dead. Nearly a quarter of their people had been lost. This was not a simple move to new land. It was a forced march of death. It tried to wipe away their homes, their spirit, and their future. When the last Cherokee arrived in March of 1839, the walking was done, but the pain did not end. The Trail of Tears had taken not only lives, it had stolen a way of living, a sacred bond to old lands, a thread that tied generations together. The survivors were sick and exhausted. Their hearts were heavy with grief. Many elders who carried stories and songs were gone. Many children, who would have been tomorrow's hope, had died along the way. Leaders who had stood firm for their people were lost too. There was no time or space to hold true funerals. The land they came to was strange and often hard to live on. The promises made by the US government of food, help and safety were not always kept. Many were left to struggle on their own. Their bodies hurt, but so did their hearts. The deep wounds inside would echo through the lives of their children and their children's children. The Trail of Tears was more than a journey. It was a breaking. It left scars that time alone could not heal. The Cherokee had once been a proud nation. They had schools where their children learned to read and write. They had printing presses that shared their words with the world. They had their own constitution, built with care to guide their people. They trusted in the law. They believed that courts would protect them, that justice would be their shield. But their trust was betrayed. The law did not save them. Their rights were swept away, as if they were dust on the wind. Among those who survived the long removal, new wounds opened. Deep divisions grew. The ones who had signed the Treaty of New Echota, the so-called Treaty Party, were now seen by many as traitors. In June of 1839, only months after the journey west ended, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were all killed by fellow Cherokee. It was an act of vengeance, born from pain and loss. The unity of their nation, already cracked by removal, broke even further under the weight of anger and grief. Yet even in this ruin, the Cherokee did not vanish. They began again. They rebuilt their schools. They re-established their government. They started printing newspapers once more. They held fast to their language, their stories, their songs, their faith. The strength that had once carried them through courtrooms and long negotiations now became the quiet, stubborn power of simply surviving. Still, the scars of what had been done ran deep. They do not fade easily. They are carried even now. In American textbooks, the story was often shortened, softened, called relocation or resettlement. But for the Cherokee, for the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, this was not a relocation. It was a rupture, a heartbreak passed down through generations. The Trail of Tears is not just a story in an old book. It is a wound, still healing. It is a living memory. It rests in families, in whispered tales handed down, in the very soul of a people forced to leave behind all they knew. In that memory there is sorrow, but also an unbroken strength. And the Cherokee were not alone. Their trail is the most spoken of today, but the Indian Removal Act of 1830 set its sights on many nations. Each had its own language, its own lands, its own songs. Each faced its own heartbreak. The Choctaw were the first. In 1831, thousands were driven from Mississippi and Alabama. Most walked on foot. They had no wagons, few supplies. As they traveled through freezing rains and flooded rivers, hundreds died. A Choctaw chief later called it a trail of tears and death. That sorrowful phrase would echo through time. Next were the Creek. Once strong in the southeast, they faced years of broken promises and bloody fights with settlers and militias. By 1836, over 15,000 Creek were forced west, many in chains. Thousands died along the way. Others were torn from their families and sold into slavery, or scattered far from kin. The Chickasaw tried to secure money for their lands before leaving. They did negotiate payment, but that did not spare them suffering. Delays in receiving funds left them without what they needed. Hundreds died from hunger and disease as they made their way west. The Seminole of Florida resisted the hardest. From 1835 to 1842, they fought a fierce guerrilla war in tangled swamps and dark forests. Leaders like Osceola became bright flames of defiance, but even they could not stand forever against the might of the US Army. Thousands were captured or killed. Many were marched to Indian Territory. Some fled deep into the Everglades, where their descendants still live today. Altogether, more than 100,000 native people were torn from their homelands during this era. The government called it policy. Settlers called it progress. For native nations, it was nothing less than disaster. Each people walked a different path, but the same dark threads ran through them all: betrayal, suffering, and loss. Sacred homelands were stripped away. Centers of culture were broken apart. Families and memories were stretched to the breaking point. And yet they carried with them their songs, their words, their spirit. Into a strange land that did not welcome them, they brought all that could not be taken by force. When at last the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw and Seminole reached Indian Territory, today called Oklahoma, they found a place unlike what they had left. The US had promised fertile soil, safety from white encroachment, and lands they could keep forever. But these promises were as fragile as breath. The land was unfamiliar, the weather harsher, crops struggled to grow. Traditional ways of building homes did not always work. Winters were bitter, summer droughts burned the earth. Communities arrived at different times, sometimes months apart. Many families never arrived at all. Disease followed them, cholera, smallpox, influenza. Grief settled in every new village like a cold mist. The government had promised aid, animals, tools, food, money, but these often came late, if at all. Corruption ran through the system. Supplies spoiled or disappeared. Resources meant to help families start over were stolen by contractors or swallowed up in tangled bureaucracy. Worse still, even this permanent land was not truly safe. As white settlers kept moving west, as new states formed, pressure grew. Railroads cut through these supposed homelands. Treaties were rewritten, ignored, or twisted by clever legal tricks. Bit by bit, even this promised land shrank. Still, the native nations worked to rebuild. The Cherokee created a new capital at Tahlequah. They raised schools and renewed institutions. The Choctaw and Chickasaw formed governments. They wrote fresh constitutions. Councils met under open skies. Churches rose from the ground. Fields were planted. Communities began to mend, not by forgetting, but by enduring. Yet always the old shadow lay over them. Every promise made was fragile. The same forces that had driven them from their first homes, greed, expansion, disregard, hovered close. What was supposed to be a forever home became only a pause. Many believed at last they would have peace. History would show how wrong that hope was. The story of the Trail of Tears did not end in Indian Territory. It merely turned to the next long chapter of struggle. For survival, for self-rule, for respect. For many years after, the Trail of Tears lived mostly in silence. It was spoken of softly, kept alive in family stories, often ignored by the broader nation that had caused such pain. It remained an open wound, shared quietly among native communities. But it did not fade. In Cherokee homes, elders told the tale of the long march, of the bitter cold, of the empty arms left by sickness and hunger. Songs were sung for the lost. Ceremonies honored their memory. Oral histories kept alive the names of those who walked and of those who did not survive. The land remembered too. Old trails, hidden graves, scraps of documents, all lay like faint scars across the continent. It was not only a trail of sorrow, it was also a trail of survival. The resilience of native nations after removal stunned those who had tried to wipe them away. In the years that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole did more than survive. They built again. They formed governments, opened schools, printed newspapers, spoke their languages, kept their spiritual ways alive. Against all odds, they endured. But for too long, outside their circles, there was only silence. The silence was heavy. It filled the spaces between words, between stories, between people. For many years, the wider world did not listen, did not see, did not understand. The pain of removal, the loss of homeland, the broken promises, were tucked away in quiet hearts. But inside native communities, the memory lived on. A flame passed from one hand to the next, a song sung softly in the night. And slowly, awareness began to grow. Historians started to search. Writers began to tell the stories. Families spoke louder than before. The Trail of Tears was not forgotten. It was not erased. It was remembered as a testament to suffering and to strength. The story is still unfolding, even now. The descendants of those who walk the trail carry their legacy forward, their stories, their culture, their spirit. It is a story of survival, of resilience, of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light. Even when all seems lost, there is a way forward. And so, the trail continues, not just as a memory, but as a living part of a people's journey. Today, the Trail of Tears is honoured in many ways. Monuments stand quietly in places where the footsteps once fell. Rivers and paths whisper the names of those who travelled before us. Schools teach the history, not as a distant past, but as a living story, one that shapes the present and guides the future. But beyond the history books and memorials, the true legacy lies in the hearts of native peoples themselves, in the songs still sung in native languages, in the ceremonies that call the ancestors near, and in the steady, enduring care for the land. This story reminds us all that justice can be delayed, but memory cannot be silenced, that even in great sorrow, hope quietly blooms. The journey of the Cherokee and so many other nations is a gentle call to listen, to understand, and to honor. For when we do, we carry forward not just their story, but a piece of our shared humanity, a soft, steady light, guiding us toward respect, compassion, and healing. Not until late in the 1900s did most people in America start to really think about the sadness of the Trail of Tears. It took many years and the efforts of activists and tribal leaders to bring this story back into the minds of the country. Little by little, people began to remember. New memorials were built, paths were marked to show where the people had walked. Schools slowly changed their lessons to teach the truth. The words Trail of Tears became known not just by historians, but by regular people everywhere. But simply knowing the story is not the same as making things right. The pain from those times still reaches into today. Being torn away from their homelands, living with the heavy weight of that history, and carrying the broken promises made to their ancestors. These things continue to shape how native communities live now. Yet, through all these hard times, the strength of these nations does not fade. The same strong spirit that once led them through thick forests, across cold rivers, and into forced exile is still alive today. It lives on in programs that bring back old languages, in efforts to keep traditions alive, and in the stories that families share around fires and kitchen tables. So the Trail of Tears is not only about what was lost, it is also about what was carried forward. It holds faith, memory, and a deep, stubborn will to go on living. Today, when people speak of the Trail of Tears, they do not see it only as something that happened long ago. It is also a living memory. It stands as a reminder of wrongs done, but also of the power to endure. It shows us what it takes to keep moving forward when the world seems to turn against you. The same paths that once shook with the sorrowful steps of so many now have a new meaning. They are sacred places of remembrance. All across the United States, you can find monuments, trails, and museums that mark the journey. In 1987, Congress made the Trail of Tears into a National Historic Trail. It stretches more than 5,000 miles across 9 states, tracing the many routes people were forced to take when they were sent west. It winds through quiet woods, wide fields, and small towns. It gently invites people today to walk, even just for a little while, in the footsteps of those who suffered. But to truly remember means more than visiting a monument. For the children and grandchildren of those who once walked this trail, memory lives on in their communities, in their languages, and in their ceremonies. Many tribal nations still honor their ancestors by riding horses along parts of the trail each year, by gathering to tell stories, and by teaching young people the old words of their people. Once, these stories were nearly erased. Now they are spoken with pride. Schools teach them, films show them. Writers and poets give voice to both the sorrow and the strength of that time. Native youth grow up knowing that their identity is not only about surviving. It is about courage, resistance, and a thread of life that does not break. Still, there is much more to be done. The Trail of Tears continues to challenge us to think about how we tell and remember history. It asks us to look closely at the real cost of growing a nation, to see the cruelty behind old laws and policies, and to understand that many native people still struggle because of these past wounds. It reminds us that when progress comes without care for human beings, it is not true progress at all. It is something closer to erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears, we must do more than look back. We must listen. We must learn. We must lift up the voices that were once pushed aside. We must see that the story of America is not whole without the story of its native nations. Not just in the past, but right now and in every part of the future. And so, we remember, not only with sadness, but with deep respect. Because even when they were betrayed and forced from their homes, these people kept walking. They did not disappear. They endured. In the bitter cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a place heavy with worry. This small Puritan settlement sat deep inside the harsh New England woods. It was more than just a cluster of farms and wooden meeting houses. It was a community standing on the edge of falling apart, both in spirit and in how people lived together. The people of Salem believed they were chosen by God. They thought they had been placed in this wild, dangerous land to build a life that was holy and good. But under all their prayers and rules, fear had been growing for years. Tension and hidden anger lay just beneath the surface. These Puritans followed a very strict way of living. They believed in a world that could not be seen, full of angels and demons. To them, the devil was not just an idea. He was real, alive, always looking to trick and hurt them. They believed witches could sign the devil's book, that these witches could then cast dark spells and pull innocent souls into sin. To question any of this was to question the holy words of Scripture. To doubt a minister was to doubt God himself. And in Salem, there was plenty of spiritual weight pressing down on people's shoulders. Their minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, was a man who split the village in two. He was harsh. He was quick to see evil in others. He often seemed almost fearful, as if he expected the devil to jump out at any moment. His sermons roared with threats of hell and the devil's work. Some found his words stirring. Others felt only dread. He tore the congregation apart with his loud warnings, opening deep cracks between neighbours and even inside families. But the church was not the only place Salem felt strained. Money and power caused their own troubles. There was a long fight between Salem Village and the richer Salem town nearby. This feud never really rested. Land was always in dispute. Where one farm ended and another began could quickly turn into an angry argument. Old grudges sat there, quiet but strong, waiting to come out. Property, belief, and personal fights all mixed together until no one could truly tell them apart. On top of this, the dark woods all around Salem were a source of fear. The memory of fierce Native American attacks during King Philip's War was still sharp in people's minds. Just the year before, crops had failed. Smallpox had torn through homes, leaving death behind. To the Puritans, none of these things happened by accident. They believed disaster was a sign, God's punishment for sins no one would confess. It was in this thick air of religious fear, political fighting, and a desperate fight just to survive that something started with a few young girls. Their strange behaviour, their sudden screams and wild words would not be brushed aside as simple childish play. Not here, not in Salem. Because in Salem, the devil was a living thing. And in 1692, the people truly believed he had come to stand among them. It all began, as many sad stories do, with children. In the cold month of January 1692, two young girls in Salem Village started to act in troubling ways. One was 9-year-old Betty Parris. The other was her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams. At first, their families simply watched with concern, but soon that concern turned to alarm. The girls screamed out loud. They thrashed their arms and legs. They twisted their small bodies into shapes that looked painful and wrong. They barked like dogs. They threw things across rooms. Their mouths poured out sounds that made no sense. When adults tried to scold them, the girls wailed in agony. They said unseen hands pinched them, pricked them with sharp needles. No one could understand it. Reverend Parris, Betty's own father, found the behaviour deeply upsetting. Still, at first, he hoped it might pass. Maybe it was an illness of the body or mind that could be healed. But then a local doctor, William Griggs, came to see the girls. After looking them over, he gave a frightening answer. They were, he said, under an evil hand. In a place like Salem, where religion and superstition filled every corner of life, that could mean only one terrible thing: witchcraft. It did not stop there. Other girls began to show the same strange fits. Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard joined in. Their cries and twisted movements grew worse. Soon, The whole village watched them, caught between horror and fascination. These girls were not unknown or unimportant. They were daughters from good families, respected in the Puritan world. That made their words powerful. People listened to them. When pressed to explain what was hurting them, the girls did something that would forever change Salem, and even all of Massachusetts. They pointed their fingers. The first person they accused was Tituba. She was an enslaved woman in the Paris home, brought from the Caribbean. To the Puritan eye, she was already suspicious. Foreign, dark-skinned, with stories and customs they did not understand. Next, the girls named Sarah Good. She was poor, often without a home, begging to survive. Then came Sarah Osborne. She had shocked the town by staying away from church and by marrying her servant, which many thought shameful. 3 women, each one vulnerable in her own way. Suddenly, they were the center of every fearful whisper in Salem. They were seized and taken to jail. The village's long, cold winter had found a target. When the 3 women were brought before the village to be questioned, the mood was heavy with fear and suspicion. Neighbors gathered close, whispering, eyes wide. They wanted answers. They wanted someone to blame for the strange fits and sudden troubles that had fallen on Salem. Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne stood there, under the sharp gaze of magistrates and ministers. They were pressed with harsh questions. Did they serve the devil? Had they signed his book? Were they sending spirits to harm these girls? Sarah Good denied everything. She was poor and desperate, but she insisted she was no witch. Sarah Osborne, who was already sick and weak, also denied it. But Tituba's story was different. Under threats and likely fear for her life, she confessed. She said that yes, she had seen the devil, that yes, there were witches among them. Her words spilled out in vivid, frightening images of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and witches riding on sticks. Perhaps she hoped that by confessing, she might save herself, but her confession only fed the village's panic. Now people were certain that dark forces truly walked among them. Tituba's stories made the invisible enemy feel even closer, even more real. And once the idea took hold, it spread quickly, like a cold wind slipping under every door. Soon more girls claimed to be afflicted. They cried out in pain, fell to the floor, or screamed that they saw witches perched high up on the beams of the meeting house. They pointed out people in the crowd, saying their spectres were tormenting them right then and there. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges rose up. If someone's cow had died or a child had fallen sick, it was easy to wonder if witchcraft was behind it. And now, it seemed, they had proof. The girls' cries and fits were treated as evidence enough. Accusations began to pour in. More and more people were named, not only poor beggars or outsiders, but respected church members, even some who had been trusted for years. Husbands watched their wives taken away. Children saw their mothers dragged off in chains. The small jailhouses quickly filled. The courts set up special sessions to handle the growing flood of cases. For the people of Salem, this was not just a legal problem. It was not only gossip or small village troubles. They saw it as a crisis of the soul, a true spiritual emergency. If witches really lived among them, they had to be found. They had to be rooted out and removed, or else, the entire village believed, God's anger might fall even harder upon them all. What had started as a strange sickness in a single household now spread like wildfire. It became a deep panic that touched every home, and as more and more accusations were whispered from mouth to ear, no one was safe. Not neighbors, not friends, not even family. Salem had opened the door to fear, and once fear stepped inside, it refused to leave. Through the early months of 1692, nearby villages also caught this terror. More names were spoken in dark corners, in low voices, thick with dread. Then Salem's courts began to rely on something new, something that had never been used before in any English-speaking court. It was called spectral evidence. This idea would soon become the most harmful and dangerous part of the trials. It was also the most argued about, even by the people of that time. Spectral evidence was built on a chilling belief that a witch could send her spirit, her spectre, out into the world, leaving her own body behind. This ghost-like shape could then torment innocent people from far away. So, in the crowded courtrooms, the afflicted girls would suddenly scream. They would clutch their necks or point and cry out, saying they saw the accused person's spirit pinching them, choking them, stabbing them. All the while, the accused stood right there in the room, silent, confused, horrified. But to the Puritan mind, this was not a game. It was not a trick of imagination or theatre. They believed it was true. They believed it proved that the person standing before them had made a dark promise to the devil. When the accused tried to deny it, saying they were innocent, many villagers thought they were simply lying. When they stood quiet, shocked into speechlessness, that too was taken as proof they were guilty. Only those who confessed often found some mercy, especially if they then pointed out more witches. This created a cruel twist, a reason to lie. People learned that admitting to witchcraft, even falsely, might save them from the noose, and so the courts were soon flooded with confessions. Some were pulled out through threats and harsh questioning. Others were given out of desperate hope to stay alive. Tituba, the enslaved woman who had been accused first, was one of these. Pressed hard by her questioners, frightened and alone, she confessed. She said a tall man from Boston, a figure clearly meant to suggest the devil, had come to her. He promised her freedom if she served him. Tituba spoke of strange beasts, of flying spirits, of a dark book filled with names of those who had also made deals with Satan. Her words were vivid, eerie, like something out of a nightmare. To this day, no one truly knows if Tituba crafted this story to protect herself, or if fear and confusion shaped it in her mind. Perhaps it was a mixture of both, but no matter the reason, her confession had a huge effect. It seemed to prove that witches were real. It gave weight to everything the girls were saying, and it sent fresh waves of fear rushing through the village. If witches could move unseen, then truly anyone could be guilty. A neighbour, a dear friend, even a close family member. Soon, more and more people began to confess, some because they were threatened, some because they thought it was the only way to live, and those who refused to admit any guilt, who held to their innocence, were often treated the worst of all. It was as if denying witchcraft only made the court more certain you were lying. Inside the cold, dim courtrooms lit by flickering candles, it became hard to tell what was true and what was fantasy. The cries of the afflicted girls, the whispers of neighbours, the stories spun by frightened minds, all of it tangled together until reason drowned under hysteria. A few ministers spoke up, asking for caution. They warned that things might be going too far, but most of the time their voices were brushed aside. The current of fear was simply too strong. Before long, the jails were overflowing. They filled with people who had once been trusted in the village. Farmers, midwives, faithful churchgoers, even children. The very heart of justice in Salem was cracking. It seemed that no law, no tradition, no kindness or sense of fairness could stand up against the terror that had gripped their town. A town that had once been ruled by scripture and strict order was now guided by something else entirely. Not by calm minds or careful thought, but by visions, by screams, and by shadows no one else could see. And still the accusations kept growing. They spread like a stain that could not be scrubbed out. By the spring of 1692, Salem's jails were overflowing. What had started as a local trouble, a few frightened girls, a handful of uneasy families, had grown into a true disaster. More than 100 people were locked away. The whole colony was struggling under the weight of fear and confusion. In an effort to take control, Massachusetts Governor William Phips created a special court. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Those old words simply meant to hear and to decide. Its only purpose was to handle the witchcraft cases. This court gathered in Salem town. Among its judges were respected men: William Staunton, Samuel Swall, John Haythorne. They were known for their learning and their long service. But even they could not keep the panic out of the courtroom. Fear bent the rules. Spectral evidence was allowed. Rumours and gossip carried weight. Doubting the accusers was seen as dangerous, perhaps even as siding with the devil. The first to stand trial and be sentenced to death was a woman named Bridget Bishop. She was already whispered about in Salem. Neighbours thought her too loud, too bold. She wore bright clothes, she ran a tavern. Years before, someone had even accused her of witchcraft. So when it came time to find a first example, she was an easy choice. In June, during her trial, the afflicted girls shrieked that they could see Bridget's spirit pinching them, laughing at them, mocking them, right there in court. Bridget denied everything, but in Salem, protest was useless. Her very resistance was taken as proof she must be lying. She was convicted quickly. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged, the first to die, but by no means the last. With her death, the machinery of accusation and execution sped up. Week after week, new prisoners were dragged before the judges. Some of these were well-respected people. They were long-time church members, midwives who had delivered half the village's children, landowners with wide fields. Others were poor beggars, old widows, or people who had once worked as servants. What linked them was not real guilt. It was suspicion, it was envy, it was old grudges and small slights that now turned deadly. In these courtrooms lit by flickering candles, the accused stood almost without hope. Their futures often rested on how dramatically the afflicted girls screamed or fainted, or on which way the political winds happened to blow that week. Those who confessed and pointed out new witches were sometimes allowed to live. Those who insisted on their innocence were far more likely to hang. Fear guided everything. Families betrayed each other. Neighbours offered false testimony to protect themselves. Ministers still spoke up now and then, urging calm. But most of the time their words were lost, smothered by cries for the village to be cleansed of evil. Outside the town, on a rise called Proctor's Ledge, the villagers built a gallows. It stood there waiting, quiet and still, as one name after another was fed to it. By the height of the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer just a town. It was like a furnace, hot with fear, hot with anger, burning up old bonds of trust and love. The witch trials did not stay within Salem village or Salem town. They leaped like fire into nearby places, Ipswich, Andover, Gloucester. Soon all these communities were swept up too. Accusations multiplied, more jails filled. No one was beyond reach. The accused came from every part of life. Some were outsiders, beggars, people without family ties, former slaves. Others were deeply rooted, people who had lived there all their days. Church deacons, wealthy farmers, even men and women who had once helped accuse others. Once the great wheel of suspicion started to turn, it crushed everyone the same. Families were torn apart. Husbands named their wives. Wives named their husbands. Children pointed trembling fingers at their own parents. Friends betrayed lifelong friends. Even those who questioned if the trials were right, if the girls might be imagining things, became suspects themselves. In the feverish mind of the time, to doubt the witch hunts was almost the same as being a witch. Nowhere was this strange madness clearer than in how the afflicted girls behaved. In court, they would cry out in sudden pain. They would point at invisible beasts. They would mimic every move the accused person made. Sometimes they all fainted together, as if on cue. Their strange performance became the very centre of the trials. No matter how unlikely or dramatic it seemed, the judges treated it as real. Their suffering was taken as holy proof. Their screams were heard as evidence sent by God. By the end of that long summer, more than 150 people had been arrested. Still, the executions went on. Sarah Good was a homeless woman, known for begging from door to door. In July, she was hanged. She would not confess, even to save her life. But her refusal was not seen as courage. It was taken as rebellion against God. Then there was Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother, respected by nearly everyone in Salem. She was a member of the church, known for her kindness. When she was found guilty, many protested, but it did no good. Her death sent a cold message through Salem. If someone as pious as Rebecca could be hanged, then truly no one was safe. The accusations did not slow, they grew wilder. Children as young as 5 were locked in cells. Even a minister's wife was accused. Whole families were chained together in dark, crowded rooms. The colony had lost its grasp on reason. It had become the very monster it feared. Fear was Salem's true ruler now. It shaped justice, twisted memories, and smothered any voice that tried to speak against it. What had begun with a few strange fits was now something far more terrible. A society eating itself alive, one accusation at a time. As summer faded into autumn in 1692, the witch trials sank to their darkest depths. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge stood like a black tooth on the horizon. There, the air was thick with final prayers and cries for mercy that would never be answered. These executions were not hidden. They were meant to be seen, to warn others. Whole villages came. Some watched with quiet dread. Others treated it almost like a fair. One by one, the convicted were led up to the scaffold. They were tied, they whispered psalms, and then the trapdoors fell. 19 people were hanged as witches, 14 women, 5 men. All went to their deaths, still saying they were innocent. Many died with trembling voices calling on God. None were buried in the churchyard. As witches, they were denied holy ground. Some were placed in shallow, unmarked pits. A few were stolen away by family, under cover of darkness, hoping at least to give them rest. The worst death did not come from a rope, it came from stones. Giles Corey was 81, a farmer, and the husband of Martha Corey, herself accused. When he was brought to trial, Giles refused to speak. He knew that without a plea his land might still pass to his heirs. In answer, the court ordered pressing. Giles was stripped, laid on the cold ground, and heavy stones were stacked on his chest. For 2 days, he said almost nothing. Only at the end, it is said, he whispered, "More weight." And then he died, crushed, never entering a plea. His silence made him a dark hero, a sign of how cruel and unjust Salem had become. Inside the jails, those still waiting faced horrors too. Women gave birth on dirty straw, the sick died unseen. Families had to pay for their own food, their own chains. Even after the trials eased, some prisoners stayed locked away for many months more. By the time the autumn leaves fell, Salem had condemned more people for witchcraft than any other place in American history. What began as low whispers had ended in blood. Even when the executions stopped, the wound was deep. By late September, something inside the colony began to shift. It did not start with judges or ministers. It started with a quiet unease, a creeping doubt that maybe everything had gone terribly wrong. When good people like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor were hanged, neighbours began to wonder, if such upright souls were witches, who could be trusted? The madness soon reached even higher. Martha Corey, a strong churchgoer, was accused. Then Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor himself. The panic had begun to eat into the rich and powerful. It was no longer only the poor, the odd, the friendless who suffered. Reverend Increase Mather, a well-known minister and the father of Cotton Mather, finally spoke out. He preached that it was better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to die. His words were a quiet thunder against the court's cruel ways. Others found their voices too. Ministers who once cheered the trials now urged caution. Families of the accused begged in public. Nearby towns looked on in horror and began to pull away from Salem. Under this rising pressure, Governor Phipps acted. In October 1692, he shut down the court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court was formed, one that refused to accept ghostly visions as proof. Everything changed quickly. Most of those still imprisoned were found not guilty. Others were pardoned. The hangings stopped. But Salem was already scarred. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, more than 100 locked away, so many lives and homes shattered. Though the trials ended, it would be long months before every prisoner was freed, and much longer still before Salem could look itself in the eye. That autumn, the wild cries faded. The gallows stood silent. The accusing girls fell quiet. Salem was left alone with its guilt. Not witches, but fear itself had ruled them. When the final prisoners stepped out in 1693, they left behind empty cells, but Salem was still full of ghosts. Whispers of betrayal and death lingered in every home and pew. In the years after, some who took part tried to make peace with God. Judge Samuel Sewall did what few others dared. On a cold January day in 1697, during a solemn day of fasting, he stood before his church in Boston. In front of the whole congregation, he confessed his guilt and asked God's forgiveness. It was rare and humble. Others were slower. Some judges, some accusers, never apologized at all. The mood, though, had changed. Even Cotton Mather, who once defended the trials, softened in later words. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the main accusers as a child, stood before her church and admitted her lies had led to the deaths of innocent people. She said the devil had fooled her. She begged forgiveness. She was one of the only ones to name the victims aloud. Years passed. In 1711, the colony finally tried to mend its wrongs. A new law cleared many names and gave money to some families. But not all were repaid. Not all wounds closed. Generations lived under this shadow. Yet over time, Salem tried to heal. It became a lesson, not about witches, but about what happens when fear chokes reason, when courts forget fairness, when hysteria dresses itself up as truth. 3 centuries later, the story of Salem is still told, not as a tale of spells or demons, but as a dark warning. Proof of how swiftly a town can lose its soul when suspicion becomes law, and how hard it is to ever get it back. Today, Salem holds its past close, but it is not simple. People come from all over the world to walk its streets. They visit museums, small quiet rooms full of old papers and whispers of sorrow. They stop at memorials. They take guided tours following the careful steps of history. There is a place called the Salem Witch Trials Memorial. It was built in 1992, 300 years after the trials. There, 20 grey stone benches sit in silence. Each one has a name carved into it. Just the name, the date, and last words spoken long ago. There are no crimes written there, because there were none. Only soft traces of people who faced death with calm dignity, even when the world turned cruel. Salem's story is not only about visitors or ghost tales. It is a mirror we still hold up to ourselves. It shows us how fear can spread like wind through dry grass, how power can be twisted, all while saying it is for goodness, how justice can lose its way when hearts burn hotter than clear reason. Writers too have carried Salem's shadow forward. Arthur Miller, in his play The Crucible, took the old story and made it breathe again. He used it to warn about his own time, the 1950s, when people hunted for communists instead of witches. Miller showed that witch hunts do not always need witches, and that the past is never so far away. It waits, close by, watching. The families who once lived in Salem still live on. Their blood has spread through Massachusetts and across America. Some carry quiet shame, heavy as stone. Others hold close a fierce pride, knowing their kin stood strong or lived on through harsh days. In 2001, more than 300 years after the hangings, the state of Massachusetts did one last small act. It cleared the names of the last 5 victims. At last, every person once called a witch was free on paper. The Salem witch trials lasted a little over a year, such a short time. But the lessons have lasted forever. They whisper to us that truth must be guarded, even when fear roars loud, and that the worst wrongs can happen not in the dark, but right there, in the bright, clear light of day.